Good afternoon. Welcome to the Dallas STEM Environmental Education Center virtual field trip. I want to say a special welcome to Holsey Middle School. If you're watching this and you have not registered, please register at www.tiny.cc/EEC register. That's just for our record keeping only. That's the only thing it is. Today, we're going to study genetics. During this virtual field trip, students will discover that the reproduction is a characteristic of living organisms and that the instructions for traits are governed in the genetic materials. Mr. Monroe is going to tell you all about heredity. Mr. Broughton will cover sexual and asexual reproduction. Ms. Fuller will tell you about genes. And Mr. Ramirez will do a special program about some squares. During this program, if you have any questions, go to www.tiny.cc/EEC /questions/answer. Send them in. We'll do our best to answer them. If we don't get to them today, we will send them back to your teacher. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to have Mr. Monroe, or let Mr. Monroe tell you all he knows about heredity. Thank you. And carry away, Mr.
Okay, good afternoon, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and we're going to be looking at heredity. What in the world does that mean? Well, who do I look like? Do I look like my mother? Do I look like my dad? Do I look like my grandmother? Do I look like my grandfather? Or maybe as far back as my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather. Well, some people say that in my younger days that I look like my mother. Now that I'm older, they say that I look like my dad. And I can see that too. There are certain features, facial features, my body structure, I'm small bone. The only thing that's a little baffling is the fact that if we're looking at my mother, she was a short lady. We're looking at my dad, he was a short man, small bone. So maybe because of my height, could be involved with maybe the environment that I grew up because I tried to play sports. I just don't know. Heredity has a lot to do with what I look like. And that's what we're going to be investigating. If you all will bear with me, I will share my screen and we will investigate heredity by actually traveling down a PowerPoint. I think. Oh, something's not clicking. There we go. We got it. Move that over. And there we go. So when we're talking about looking like somebody, in this picture, we see there's a very diverse group of good-looking people. Now, if we were to do a little research and have their parents on, probably what we would find is that these young people probably have something to share or they look like their parents, okay, or grandparents. Students, during this little session, I want you guys to realize or recognize how biological traits are passed to successive generations. The inherited traits, most children are similar to their parents. Children tend to be similar to even sisters and brothers, siblings. I know that my sister and I, we look alike. Each child is a combination of parental traits. The combination of parental traits and maternal traits is unique for each individual. The human life cycle involves gametes, a male sperm cell plus a female egg cell fuse during fertilization to form a single cell zygote or embryo. The embryo grows by cell division in mitosis. The embryo grows into a child. The child matures into an adult. If we look at this diagram here, the mother's egg and the father's sperm each contain half of the information to build a human. The zygote, which is a single cell, which this single cell contains all the information on how to build a human. The body axis establishment, tissue, differentiation, organ systems are formed, and it forms into that embryo there, the child. All living things contain deoxyribonucleic acid, in other words, DNA, controls the structure and the function of the cell. When organisms reproduce, they pass on copies of DNA to their offspring. Because offspring have DNA from their parents, they will resemble their parents, such as these polar bears. The mother has two polar bear cubs there, and they do resemble her. DNA is sort of like an instructional manual that shows how to build and maintain a living organism. Genes, segments of DNA that carry information about how to make proteins. Structural proteins would be things such like hair. Functional proteins were for things like breaking down lactose. Genes are on chromosomes, located on the chromosomes. Number of chromosomes depends on the organism itself. For example, bacteria has one circular chromosome, but humans have 23 homologous pairs of linear chromosomes. One came from the mom and the other from the dad. Both parents give a complete instructional manual to their offspring. The egg, which comes from the mom, the sperm, which comes from the dad, it equals the zygote. The 23 pages of each instructional manual are roughly equivalent to the 23 chromosomes in each egg and sperm, equaling the zygote, which is going to have 46 pages, 46 chromosomes. Passing traits from parents to offspring is called heredity. Now, I do have a lot of characteristics from my mom and my dad. On the other hand, I do believe I picked up a few of the traits from my grandparents. Now, one thing that you're probably going to hear somebody say later on, I began to lose my hair at a young age. So that was some type of trait that was passed down to me. And as you go further into your virtual field trip today, maybe that will clarify why Mr. Monroe lost some of his hair at a younger age. I want you guys to have a very good field trip, virtual field trip, the rest of the trip that you have with us today. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Gorman. And if any of you have any questions, hopefully he'll be able to answer those questions for you. I'm going to stop sharing now. And I'm going to give it back to Dr. Gorman. All right, Dr. Gorman.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe, for really opening our eyes up to some things. Now, we do have a question. The question is, will my children look like me? And if you'll watch the rest of this program and then take a real interesting course when you're in college, it's called genetics. One of my favorite classes that I had. It really lets you know something. So we can't tell you if your children are going to look like you because it depends on what your mate or your partner is, where they have dominant hair color or they have dominant eye color. Learn how to do the little squares that Ms. Ramirez is going to tell you about. and you can kind of get a pretty good idea, maybe. Thank you so much. And now we're going to let Mr. Broughton tell us about asexual and sexual reproduction.
Thank you, Dr. Gorman. I'm going to share my screen here to get started. And again, my name is Mr. Broughton, and I'm going to be covering sexual and asexual reproduction with you this afternoon. Sexual reproduction involves two parents. Asexual reproduction just involves one parent. So in this picture below, you can see that this amoeba is able to split itself and pass its genetic information into both daughter cells. So that would be an example of asexual reproduction, but I'm actually going to get started with sexual reproduction by introducing you to some of the animals that we have out here. First are our chickens and turkeys. So there you can see this picture, I think it was, or this little video is from Saturday. This is our rooster. He's chasing off that other rooster because he wants to mate with all of these hens. And there we have a male turkey named Mr. Gobbles and our female turkey named Mrs. Gobbles. And there's another hen walking up in the background. But chickens and turkeys reproduce sexually, and then they lay an egg. And if the hen sits on the egg, it could hatch that way, or we can put those eggs in an incubator and hatch them that way. And then you get the end results would be, uh-oh. Let me try this again. Always got to be a little, well, I'm going to have to show this one slide here. For some reason, I don't want to show up. That little chick there is a chick that hatched, and let me click refresh. I bet that'll fix it. There we go. So now you can see that a little better. That is a chick that hatched here this past spring, and it is a naked neck chicken. That's why it doesn't have any feathers on its neck. That is a trait that can be passed from the parent to the offspring. And so there's nothing wrong with that chicken. That's just how those ones are born. Then we'll meet our cows that we have out here. This is Freckles the bull. He is the male cow, and then the female cow is Obsidian the black Angus, and they mated and had an offspring, which is Oreo the calf there. That is a picture of the day she was born, which was December 5 of 2020. Is that right? No, that's not right. 2019, because she's just a little over a year old now. And there's her drinking milk for the first time and taking a nap. Calves are a lot like people, like little babies. They eat and sleep a lot when they're first born. There's a picture of her and her mom this summer. So she was around 6 months old in that picture. They grow up pretty fast. And here's a video of her. She likes it when you scratch her head. So she's kind of sniffing me at first, just to make sure that I'm not a threat. And once she finds out that you're friendly, she wants you to scratch her head because that's maybe a tough spot for her to reach, and she likes for people to do that. So when she's moving her head up and down like that, that's kind of her way of saying, keep scratching, because of maybe that hay is itching her or something. But she likes to be petted a little bit. So that is two examples of sexual reproduction that happen out here, but we also have animals and plants that reproduce asexually. So one example that we already talked about was that amoeba. They reproduce asexually through a process called binary fission. That is one type of asexual reproduction. So again, that amoeba is able to split and pass its DNA into both daughter cells so that one becomes two, and it reproduces that way. Another type of asexual reproduction is called fragmentation. So I'm going to play you a little section of this video here to show how that works. So this is a flatworm called a planaria. They're not very big. You'll see a picture. There we go. They're really small little flatworms, pretty harmless to humans, although they're not the most fun to touch because they're flatworms. But what's amazing about them is that they can reproduce through a process called fragmentation. And you're about to see how that works here. That scientist at Stanford University is going to cut this planaria into sections. So there he just cut the head off. There he cut a section of the body. And there he cut the tail off, that last section of the body. So there's 4 sections now. And if that happened to most animals, they would die. But a planaria is not only unharmed, but it's going to live and become 4 new planaria because it can reproduce by a process called fragmentation. So it's already healing itself, and this is it healing itself overnight. It's pretty amazing how they can do that. I mean, if you get a cut, your body will heal itself, but if you cut something off, it can't grow a whole new you. And so there, again, it's healing up, and after only 3 days, it's starting to grow. After 1 week, you can see here, those 2 little spots are new eyes that it grew from scratch on that chunk that was the middle of its body when he first got cut up. So that's the start of a head. And by day 12, you can see it's pretty much a whole new worm. I mean, not 100% grown yet, but you could definitely see the eyes there, and the tail was about to show up, but I didn't want to watch the whole video. That's like the whole thing's like 5 minutes. It's too long. So planaria reproduce by fragmentation. One other type of asexual reproduction is budding. So there is an organism called a hydra that looks like this. And this one has a little lump on it that's going to keep growing and growing and then eventually break off into a whole new independent second hydra. So it reproduces asexually. There's just the single parent that it started with and ended with, but they reproduce through a process called budding, which is kind of interesting. And then there's spore formation. So some plants reproduce asexually, and they grow spores on the other side of their leaves. This is a plant called a fern. And if you go to the grocery store or Walmart or Target, a lot of Lowe's, Home Depot have ferns. On the underside of their leaves, they might have this spore called sori. Although I've noticed a lot of plants sold in stores don't have this. They can genetically breed them to not have that, and they do that. I'm not sure exactly why they do that, but they just don't have these spores on them. But in nature, that's how they reproduce. So each one of these spores can become a whole new plant with the identical genetic material, because this is an asexual reproduction. And I'm gonna do a quick commercial break. If you are in the Dallas Independent School District, as a teacher or student, and you saw some of these things that I just showed you, you're like, hey, I would like to do that. Let me bring this website to the front here so that you can see the whole thing. I didn't realize I'd cut that off. There we go. And you can order from our Living Materials Center protozoans like that amoeba that can reproduce asexually. You can order fertile chicken eggs to incubate to see the life cycle of a chicken. You can order planaria, ferns. I'm going to show you a plant in just a minute called coleus. You can order these as well, all for free from our Living Materials Center, so you can study sexual and asexual reproduction right in your classroom. So let me actually jump out of this now and stop sharing my screen and show you a couple of the plants that we have. So just got to scoot my laptop away here. Here is kind of a sad looking one, but a fern plant is what I was referring to that have the sori on them. This one doesn't have that though. I think I got this at Home Depot and they sell them without the sori, but we can get them with sori as well. And then here is a coleus plant, and I want to get all the way to the top of it there. And this plant can reproduce asexually through a process called vegetative, now I forgot the word, propagation, vegetative propagation. So I'm going to get an empty pot here. Well, it's got potting soil in it, but show you how that works, actually demonstrate vegetative propagation. So I'm going to go ahead, and this is getting a little tall here. snip this plant off right here. And normally that would kill some plants. Like this piece would not be able to survive, but Coleus is special. So I've made a little stem there, and I'm going to dip that stem into some rooting hormone. It's just a white powder that encourages roots to grow. You don't have to use this, but since I have it, I'm going to use it. Kind of coat that bottom there with some of that rooting growth hormone and just poke it in the dirt. And that's going to be able to grow into a whole new plant. The plant has the genetic material to grow either additional leaves or stems or roots if it needs to. And now that I've cut that off and poked it in the soil, it knows it needs to grow roots. And in a few days, it will have roots down there. I'm going to give it a little bit of water because especially when you first do a cutting of these, they're going to want some water, but that's going to be a whole new plant that'll grow as big or bigger than this one after a little while. So that is my section on sexual and asexual reproduction. Now I'm going to pass it back to Dr. Gorman to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Broughton. And I can say from a classroom teacher aspect that we used to use the plants all the time, and it's really a good project. You start them out and you measure the height of them and you measure the width and you watch them grow and keep a record of them and all. Now, we did have a question. Can humans reproduce asexually? Most of you probably know that answer. If you don't, the answer is no, they cannot. They cannot do that. Now I'm going to turn it over this time to Miss Fuller. She's going to tell you about genes.
Hi, boys and girls. We're going to talk about the different traits that we inherit from our parents. So I'm going to share my screen with you. We're going to look at this. So we're going to look at inherited traits of individuals. So traits are passed from parents to the children. So we're going to talk about several different traits that you're real familiar with. First one being hair color. There are 124 genes that determine hair color. And some colors are dominant over others. Dark hair is dominant over light colored hair. But two people who have dark hair can have blonde children, but the odds are only 1 in 4 of that happening. Now, Ms. Ramirez is going to show you some Punnett squares at the end, and you're going to understand how it's possible for 2 brunettes to have blonde children. Now, I've got 2 pictures there. The one on the left is 3 women who have red hair. Red hair is the least common color of hair in the world. It was caused by a mutation about 100,000 years ago on the steppes of Central Asia or Asia Minor. And as people migrated across the planet, they took the gene with them. And you see a preponderance of red hair in 2 countries, Scotland and Ireland. Associated with the expression of red hair, you usually see very, very pale skin. Now, pale skin is a very positive aspect if you live close to the Arctic Circle, because there's not a lot of sunlight and people need to make vitamin D, and they make vitamin D with sun. And in order to do that, they have to be exposed to sun and they have to absorb it. Well, this pale skin makes it easy for them to absorb sun in a region of the air, region of the world where it's not real sunny. However, this is very detrimental if they live close to the equator, because it leads them open to receiving too much sun, which can cause melanoma, which is a deadly form of cancer. Okay, and the lady on the right-hand side has dark hair. Her hair appears to be black. Black hair and dark brown hair are dominant over blonde hair. That's why most people in the world have dark hair as opposed to blonde or red. Now on the right-hand side of the screen, you see musical ability. Musical ability is inherited. Now it's controlled by 23 genes, but it's also influenced by environment and by practice. And believe it or not, practice is also influenced by genes. Some people receive a gene that it causes them to be intrinsically motivated to practice. And that's how people get good at music, is by practicing a lot. And so we've got two people there. The one on the left is Felix Mendelssohn. He wrote the orchestral pieces associated with Midsummer's Night Dream and also Fingal's, it's not Fingal's Castle, Fingal's Island, maybe. It's about the it's about the Hebrides Islands in Scotland. And his sister was also very gifted musically. Now on the right, you've got Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, and his sister was very gifted musically. His father was very gifted musically. Unfortunately, the two girls, the Mendelssohn girl and the Mozart girl, were not encouraged with their musicality. Back then, your parents got to choose your career. And speaking of parents choosing their career, the Strauss family is very, very well known for their waltz music, and many, many members of their family were very gifted musically. Johann Strauss was called the Mozart of the waltz, and he had 3 children, and he chose their careers, and all 3 disobeyed him and became musicians because it was such an integral part of who they were. Now let's see if we can go to the next one. The next one is eye color and blood type. Eye color is determined by the amount of melanin in the iris. There are 150 genes that contribute to eye color. Brown eyes are the most common. Those are the ones you see all over the world. Most people have brown eyes. Green eyes are the least common. Now the genes for brown and green eyes are both dominant, but we've got another eye color, blue, and blue eye genes are recessive. So can 2 people with brown eyes have a blue-eyed child? Well, the answer is yes. You'll learn about that, about dominant and recessive genes, when you get to the next section with Ms. Ramirez. And so fewer people have blue eyes than brown, and green are the most rare. Okay, for blood type is inherited from your parents, and the percentages of the blood type in the population are 44% are type O, 42% are type A, 10% are type B, and only 4% are type AB. A and B are dominant over O and AB. O is recessive, and so blood typing is very interesting when you get into high school. That's one of the labs you'll probably do with typing your own blood. Height and body type. Height, over 700 genes have been discovered that determine a person's height, but nutrition and environment also play a role. On both sides of my family, my mother's side and my dad's side, my grandparents were short because they grew up in a time in the United States when food was somewhat scarce. So they did not achieve their full potential physically, but all of the children on both sides were tall and very robust people. So good nutrition plus their gene types enabled them to grow tall. Now, the other one is body type, and there are 3 basic body types: the ectomorph, who is tall and slender; the mesomorph, who is average height but very muscular; and the endomorph, who is average height but tends to be a little on the heavy side. And you can tell by looking in people's families which type their body is and probably who they inherited it from. Now we've got two diseases we're going to talk about really quickly. These are both inherited. They're both recessive traits. One is sickle cell anemia, and that's where the red blood cell is shaped like a sickle instead of like a frisbee. Because of this, the blood does not do a good job of oxygenating the cells, and people can get pain from this, and also can get some organ damage. And the other one is cystic fibrosis, and this is a recessive gene inherited from both parents. And if you only have one copy of the gene, and this is also true for sickle cell, but you don't have the disease, that person's called a carrier. And if you don't want to pass it on to your children, they have something called genetic counseling, and the counselors can tell you what things you can do. With cystic fibrosis, these people have thicker mucus than the rest of us. And so this thick mucus can affect their lungs and their digestive system. So genetics is a fascinating subject, and you'll go more into that in biology in high school, and then of course in college you'll probably get very deep in it. If you have any questions about traits inherited from parents, you can ask Dr. Gorman, and I'm going to turn you over to him.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fuller. And we did have a question. It is, are there any other diseases that can be determined by a gene? And there's a lot of current studies right now on breast cancer. And they have determined that some genes, if you have some genes, you have an increased chance perhaps of getting breast cancer. And so they're doing a lot of studying now to see if there's anything they can do about it in the earlier stages. Thank you so much, Ms. Fuller. And now we're going to hear from Ms. Ramirez about some really interesting little squares that kind of help you determine what your kids are going to look like.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and we're going to be learning about Punnett squares and their role in genetics. So I'm actually going to share my screen with y'all, and we'll start our presentation. And let me just make it full screen so that y'all can see it. So we're just going to go over a couple of quick vocabulary words to help you better understand genetics and exactly what a Punnett square is. So let's look at question number 1. A blank is a form of a gene. Now this will come in handy when we start talking about our Punnett squares. So a form of a gene is called an allele. For number 2, a blank of an individual describes the specific alleles of a gene that the individual carries. So this is the scientific word for essentially the genetic makeup of an individual. So hopefully you guys already know this. So for number 2, we're talking about a genotype. And that's super easy to remember because genotype sounds very familiar to genetic. So they both start with the same letter G. So number 3, the blank of an individual describes the outward expression of the genes carried by an individual. So essentially, this is telling us what that individual is going to look like. So hopefully you said for number 3, that is describing the phenotype. And by using a Punnett square, we can get both genotype and phenotype ratios. And then number 4, the blank is considered the father of genetics. And I actually have a portrait of him here as well. And he also is very famous for his studies with pea plants. So hopefully you said number 4 is Gregor Mendel. He is the father of genetics. And speaking of those pea plant studies, we're going to be looking at that in just a second. So to help you understand Punnett squares, we first have to understand a couple of more vocabulary words. So homozygous individuals have 2 copies of the same allele. Heterozygous individuals have only 1 copy of one allele and then 1 copy of a second allele. So if we take a look at this pea plant monohybrid cross over here in the corner, this Punnett square, are the parent pea plants homozygous or heterozygous? And how do you know that? So take a look at the yellow pea plant parent over here and the green pea plant parent over here, that's a mouthful. Are these parents going to be heterozygous or homozygous? So let's take a look. Hopefully you guys said that these parents are both homozygous. So we know that because they both have, if we take a look at our green parent over here, this pea plant has both an uppercase, has two uppercase alleles for that green. And then this pea plant over here has two lowercase, so they're the same. So homozygous just means the same. So they have the same alleles. And then the dominant allele is the one that is expressed in heterozygous individuals. And also when you're looking at a Punnett square, the dominant allele is going to be the uppercase, the one in the uppercase. And then we have the recessive allele phenotype is only seen in homozygous recessive individuals. So for example, if we look at our Punnett square over here, under what scenario would we be able to see the recessive phenotype? And we know by looking at our Punnett square over here, we know that green, the color green, is going to be the dominant trait because it's uppercase. So when we mix or fertilize the yellow pea pod with the green pea pod that are both homozygous, 100% of the offspring they're all going to be green, since that's the dominant trait. Now, again, if we go back to the question I asked, under what scenario could we have a recessive phenotype? So under what scenario could we have maybe a yellow pea pod? So in that case, we could have a yellow pea pod if this parent over here was heterozygous. So maybe this parent had an uppercase G and then a lowercase g, and then we would be able to see that yellow recessive trait pop up again. So let's look at another example with some of our cattle that we have. So this is Freckles the Longhorn, and this is Obsidian the Black Angus. They actually mated. So of course we know cows mate through sexual reproduction. So they mated and they had an offspring. So let's use this Punnett square to see what the odds of their offspring looking like might be. And we're going to be using, since this is a monohybrid cross, mono just means one, we're using one trait, and that one trait we're going to be using for our example is spots. So let's say spots is the dominant trait and no spots is the recessive trait. So let's take a look, and the way Punnett square works, it's super easy. All we're doing is just matching our two letters together. So let's take this first quadrant here. We have a big S and a little s. So we're just going to put big S, little s. We're going to move down to our next quadrant down here. We have big S over here, little s over here. So again, we have the same thing. We're going to move to our next quadrant. We have the big S with the little s again over here. So we're filling it in. And then we have that one last quadrant left. So we have the big S over here mixed with the little s over here. And that gives us the same thing. Now this happened to be a super easy Punnett square. So we know that based upon this Punnett square, we know that 100% of the offspring will have spots. And having spots, that's going to be the phenotype. So when we look at the offspring, we're going to see those spots. We also know that the genotypes, so the letters that you see here represent the genotypes, 100% will be heterozygous, meaning they're going to have, let's say, represented as the big S, little s. So they're all going to be heterozygous. So that's a good example of how genetics plays a role here at the Environmental Center. And here's just a review. Here's father Freckles, mother Obsidian, and then baby Oreo. Again, she's about a year old. She's technically a cow now, or she's technically a heifer. So a heifer is just a calf that's a year or older, and she was born in December, so she's now over a year officially. And a heifer has no offspring yet, so she's technically a heifer. Cows are over a year old and they have had offspring. Of course, we know Freckles is a bull because he's not neutered, so that's how he was able to give us offspring. And then we have what are called steers, which are neutered males. And then here's our challenge question. Here's another Punnett square. See if you guys can complete it, and it's pertaining to some of our chickens. So here on the left, I have my chicken. She's a blue silky chicken. And let's say if she were to mate with a naked neck chicken, this ugly chicken over here. And we're going to say we know that the naked neck trait is actually a dominant trait. So we're going to say Pepper over here. We're going to say her genotype is going to be lowercase NN. And then we're going to say the genotype of this naked neck chicken. We're going to say that he's not totally purebred. So we're going to say that he's going to be heterozygous. So he's going to have a big N and a little n. And see if you guys can complete this Punnett square. And then when you complete it, think about what are the genotypic ratios and then what are the phenotypic ratios. So whenever people come out to visit us and they see Pepper, the blue silky, they always think, well, how come you don't mate her? She's such a beautiful chicken, you should breed her. There are no other blue silky chickens out here other than her. So the only option for her to breed with would be either some of the other regular chickens or these naked neck chickens. And since we know that naked neck trait is a dominant trait, the odds of her producing naked neck chicks is actually very high. And you can see an example of the naked neck chick here. And I personally, I don't find them really cute at all. So I really don't want any naked neck chicks and I don't want to risk it. So you guys can complete the Punnett square and see what her offspring might look like. And then something cool, this is the showgirl chicken, and it's actually a cross between a naked neck chicken and a silky chicken. So which one of these do you think is homozygous for the naked neck trait? Do you think it's the one on the left or the one on the right? And how can you tell which one might be homozygous for that naked neck trait? Now, hopefully you said that the one on the left with that pure naked neck with no feathers is the one that's going to be homozygous for the naked neck trait. The one on the right is actually heterozygous for that trait. So if you were to look at its genotype, it might be capital N, little n for the one over here on the right. And we know that because she's not totally, that chicken doesn't totally have a naked neck. It has these random tufts. So people actually selectively breed chickens to look like this, I guess because they look unique and cute or whatever. So that's another way that people use genetics for selective breeding. So I'm going to actually stop my screen share and we're going to take a quick look at my own chicken. So this is my favorite pet. This is Pepper, the blue silky chicken. They are thought to have originated from Asia. The earliest written records of these come from Marco Polo in the 13th century. He actually called these the furry chicken, but we know that these are actually feathers and not fur. They get their name blue silky because they have a blue skin patch over their ears, which will turn around for y'all. And the name silky because they feel super soft like silk when you pet them. Now, some interesting traits about these guys, they are actually polydactyl. They're one of the few chickens that have 5 toes instead of 4. So that's an interesting trait about this breed. And then they also have melanism, and that's a rare trait caused by fibromelanosis. And essentially that is what causes her skin and her bones to actually be black, like you saw in that previous image. So they have some unique traits for this breed. So I'm gonna go ahead and put her up. And that's all I have for you guys today for Punnett squares. We're gonna pass it to Mr. Gorman and he's gonna close us out.
Thank you so much, Mr. Maris. That genetics is one of the most interesting classes I ever took in college. And it'll make you think about what your kids are going to look like if you marry so-and-so and all. But another example, they wanted to know if we have another example. And I take my dog down to the dog park on the weekends so he can run around there and Waxahachie. And he's got a friend down there named Chubby. And Chubby is about 110 pounds. Huge dog. He's part St. Bernard and part blue heeler. She showed me a picture of the litter and 4 out of the 5 were little small blue heeler puppies. And then Chubby was in the middle of them, weighed about 3 times as much as the rest of them did. So I would have liked to have seen the parents on that one to see what how he came out completely different than the rest of them. Okay, we're going to thank you guys for joining us today. I hope you have a great day, the rest of the day, and hope you have a great life. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you come back to see us.